tiny hamlet called Creighton. Far around it, there spreads a waste of bleak and totally inhospitable country, bare and unpeopled. Yet in spite of its desolation, my friend Tonneson and I had elected to spend our vacation there. He had stumbled on the place the year previously, during a walking tour, and discovered the possibilities for the angler in a small, unnamed river. It was early evening when we arrived. It had taken us all day to journey the 40 miles from the railway station at Ardryan over some of the roughest tracks imaginable. Having put up our tent, we dismissed our driver, telling him to come for us at the end of a fortnight. We had brought sufficient provisions to last us, and water we could get from the stream. Tonneson had got our small oil stove lit, so I took the kettle and walked down to the river. On the way back, I passed a small group of village people. I asked them, casually, about the fishing, but instead of answering, they just stared at me. Then one of the men said something rapidly, in what I guessed to be pure Irish. It was evident that the inhabitants of these few huts in the wilderness did not know a word of English. So, with a smile and a nod, I left them, and the little crowd smiled and nodded in return, though their faces betrayed puzzlement. Next morning, we rose early and went for a swim. Then, after breakfast, we roused out our fishing tackle and strode off in the direction my friend had explored on his previous visit. During the day, we fished happily, working steadily upstream, and by evening we had one of the prettiest creels of fish that I had seen for a long while. Thus we spent several days, having splendid sport and first-rate appetites to do justice upon our prey. It was the Sunday after we arrived that we made a great discovery. Hitherto, we had always gone upstream. On that day, however, we laid aside our rods and set out for a ramble in the opposite direction. The day was warm, and we trudged along, chatting on this and that matter. And then, without any warning whatsoever, the river we had followed so confidently came to an abrupt end, vanishing into the earth. Tonneson and I stared in amazement. "Let's go on a bit," he said. "It may reappear." Presently, we came out onto the top of a high, boulder-strewn bank, from which we looked down into a wilderness of bushes and trees. From the centre of the wooded lowland there rose a great haze-like spray. "There must be a waterfall," said Tonneson. Down the sloping bank we made our way, and entered among the wilderness. The bushes were matted, and the trees overhung us, but here and there one could trace signs of a long-departed cultivation. It came to me that we were making our way through a great and ancient garden. But what a wild place it was now, so dismal and sombre. And there had grown upon our ears a distant, droning roar. Steadily, the roaring grew louder and nearer, until it appeared, as I remarked to Tonneson, almost to come from under our feet. And then suddenly, we came out from among the trees onto a great open space where, not 6 paces in front of us, yawned the mouth of a tremendous chasm, from the depths of which the noise appeared to rise, along with the spray. "Good Lord," said Tonneson. I was silent, and rather awed. On the far side of the chasm, there was something that looked like a fragment of a great ruin. "Come along," Tonneson shouted above the uproar. "We'll have a look at it." He started off around the edge of the crater-like abyss. As we neared this new thing, I saw that it was undoubtedly a portion of some ruined building. Yet it was not built on the edge of the chasm itself, but perched on a huge rocky spur over it. We walked out onto the projecting arm of rock, and I must confess to having felt an intolerable sense of terror as I looked down into the unknown depths below. Reaching the ruin, we clambered around it cautiously, and on the further side came across a mass of fallen stones. The ruin itself seemed to be a portion of the outer wall of some prodigious structure, it was so substantially built. Yet, where was the rest of whatever there had been? I saw that Tonneson was standing within a small excavation that he had made among the debris. He was brushing dirt from what looked like a book, much dilapidated. He handed his prize to me, telling me to put it in my satchel. This I did, first, however, running the pages through my fingers, and noting that they were filled with a neat, old-fashioned writing, which was quite legible, save one portion that was muddied and crumpled. Having put the volume away safely, I gave Tonneson a hand with the self-imposed excavating. Yet though we put in over an hour's hard work, we came up with nothing more than some fragments of broken wood. And so we went back once more to the safety of the land. We made a complete tour of the tremendous chasm, which we were able to observe was an almost perfect circle, save for where the ruin-crowned rock jutted out. To the north was a clear space, and we bent our steps in that direction. Here, distant from the mighty pit by some hundreds of yards, we came across a great lake of silent water. Silent, that is, save in one part, where there was a continuous bubbling. We were able to speak now without having to shout, and I asked Tonneson what he thought of the place. I told him that I didn't like it, and that the sooner we were out of it the better. He nodded, and then suddenly there came a strange wailing noise out of the wood on our left, and then silence. "Let's get out of here," said Tonneson, and he turned back the way we had come. He said nothing further, but kept on steadily. We were among the trees now, and I glanced round, nervously, but saw nothing. Yet I had a horrible feeling that we were not alone, and I kept so close to Tonneson that twice I kicked his heels. A minute, and then another, and then we came out at last upon the bare rockiness of the countryside. Once, as we moved away, there seemed to come again a distant sound of wailing, and I told myself that it was the wind. Yet the evening was breathless. After supper that night, I took the manuscript from my satchel. As we could not both read from it at the same time, Tonneson suggested that I should read it out loud. So there, seated in the opening of our tent, I began the strange tale of the house on the borderland. I am an old man. I live here in this ancient house, surrounded by huge unkempt gardens. The peasantry who inhabit the wilderness beyond say that I am mad. I have nothing to do with them. I live here alone with my old sister, who is my housekeeper. I have one friend, a dog. Yes, I would sooner have old Pepper than the rest of creation together. I have decided to start a kind of diary. For a couple of centuries, this house has had a reputation, a bad one, and until I bought it, for more than 80 years, no one had lived here. I am not superstitious, but I have ceased to deny that things happen in this house, things that I cannot explain, and therefore I must needs ease my mind by writing down an account of them. Though, should my diary ever be read when I am gone, the readers will be more convinced that I was mad. This house, how ancient it is. Though its age strikes one less perhaps than its structure, little curved towers and pinnacles with outlines suggestive of leaping flames predominate, while the body of the building is in the form of a circle. I have heard that there are old stories told amongst the country people to the effect that the devil built the place. However, that is as may be. I must have been here some 10 years before I saw any real manifestations of the so-called supernatural. It was after midnight on the 21st day of January. I was reading in my study. Pepper lay sleeping near my chair. Suddenly, without warning, the flames of the 2 candles went low and then shone with a ghastly green effulgence. Down on the floor, I heard a frightened whimper as Pepper cowered under my dressing gown. Pepper, usually as brave as a lion. And then away in the far end of the huge old-fashioned room, I became conscious of a faint glow. Steadily it grew, filling the room with gleams of quivering green light. Then they sank quickly and changed into deep, sombre crimson. The light came from the end wall. Then, as it grew duller, I was aware all at once that instead of looking at the redness, I was staring through it, and through the wall beyond. Gradually I realized that I was looking out onto a vast plain, lit with the same gloomy twilight that pervaded the room. The immensity of this plain scarcely can be conceived. In no part could I perceive its confines. Suddenly, I became conscious that I was no longer in the chair. Instead, I seemed to be hovering above it and looking down on a dim something, huddled and silent. In a little while, A cold blast struck me, and I was outside in the night, floating up through the darkness. I looked to my right and left, and saw the intolerable blackness of the night pierced by remote gleams of fire. Onwards, outwards I drove. Once I glanced behind and saw the earth, a small crescent of blue light, receding away to my left. A great while seemed to pass over me, and now I could nowhere see anything. I had passed beyond the stars and plunged into blackness. I became filled with fear and despair. Where was I going? Even as the thoughts formed, there grew against the blackness that wrapped me a faint tinge of blood. Slowly, the distant redness became plainer and larger, and presently I found I was descending upon it, and soon I sank into a great sea of sullen, red-hued clouds. Slowly I emerged from these, and there below me I saw the stupendous plain that I had seen from my room in this house that stands upon the borders of the silences. Nowhere could I descry any signs of life, not even the ruins of some ancient habitation. Gradually, I found that I was being borne forward, floating across the flat waste. Yet it was a great time before I perceived any signs of the place towards which I was being conveyed. At first, I saw it far ahead, like a long hillock on the surface of the plain. But as I drew nearer, I perceived that I had been mistaken. I made out now a great chain of mountains, whose distant peaks towered up into the red gloom. And after a time, I approached a vast rift opening out into the mountains. Through this I was borne, moving at no great speed. On either side of me, huge walls of rock-like substance rose sheer. For a while, I went on steadily, and then suddenly I was at the exit of the chasm, staring out upon an enormous amphitheatre of mountains. Yet of the mountains and the grandeur of the place I recked nothing, for I was confounded with amazement to behold, at a distance of several miles, and occupying the centre of the arena, a stupendous structure, built apparently of green jade. Yet in itself, it was not the discovery of the building that had so astonished me, but the fact that in no particular, save in colour and its enormous size, did the lonely structure vary from this house in which I live. I could scarcely believe what I saw. What does it mean? The arena appeared a perfect circle, the house, as I have mentioned, standing in the centre. I glanced upwards at the slopes of the circling mountains. How silent they were. And then as I peered, a new terror came to me, for away up among the dim peaks to my right, I had descried a vast shape of blackness, giant-like. It had an enormous ass-like head with gigantic ears. But then my gaze sprang from it to something higher up among the crags. For a long minute I gazed, fearfully. The thing was black, and had 4 grotesque arms. The features showed indistinctly. Round the neck, I made out several objects. Slowly, the details came to me, and I realized coldly that they were skulls. Straight away, I knew that I was looking at a monstrous representation of Kali, the Hindu goddess of death. Other remembrances of my old student days drifted through my thoughts. My glance fell back upon the huge ass-headed thing. Simultaneously, I recognized it for the ancient Egyptian god Set, the destroyer of souls. 2 of the old gods of mythology. I tried to comprehend to what it was all pointing. Further off, reclining off a lofty edge, I made out a livid mass, irregular and ghoulish, without form, and then I saw others. There were hundreds of them. The mountains were full of strange things, beast gods and horrors so atrocious and bestial that possibility and decency deny any further attempt to describe them. And I was filled with a terrible sense of fear and repugnance. Yet in spite of this, I wondered exceedingly, was there, after all, something in the old heathen worship? But then, in the midst of my musings, something happened. Until then, I had stayed within the shadow of the exit of the great rift. Now, without volition on my part, I drifted out and began to move slowly across the arena, towards the house. All around was spread the stark loneliness of the place, and the unbroken silence. Steadily, I neared the great building. Then, all at once, something came round one of the huge buttresses of the house. It was a gigantic thing, and moved with a curious lope, going almost upright, in the manner of a man. It was quite unclothed, and had a remarkable, luminous appearance. Yet it was the face that attracted and frightened me the most. It was the face of a swine. Silently, I watched this horrible creature. It was making its way cumbrously round the building, stopping at each window to peer in and shake the bars, with which, as in this house, they were protected. Evidently, it was searching for an ingress into the house. I had now come to within less than a quarter of a mile of the great structure, and still I was compelled forward. Abruptly, the thing turned and gazed in my direction. It opened its mouth, and for the first time the stillness of that abominable place was broken by a deep, booming note. Then, immediately, I became aware that it was coming towards me, swiftly and silently. In an instant, it had covered half the distance that lay between, and still I was borne helplessly to meet it. Only 100 yards, and the brutish ferocity of the giant face numbed me with a feeling of unmitigated horror. But then, in the very moment of my despair, I became conscious that I was looking down upon the arena, from a rapidly increasing height. I was rising. Beneath me, the foul swine creature had gone down on all fours and was snuffing and rooting at the surface of the arena. A moment, and it rose to its feet, clutching upwards, with an expression of desire upon its face, such as I have never seen in this world. Continually, I mounted higher. A few minutes passed, it seemed, and I had risen above the mountains, floating alone, afar in the redness. A tremendous distance below, the arena showed dimly, with the mighty house looking no larger than a tiny spot of green. Presently, I passed over the mountains, out above the huge breadth of the plain, and then everything vanished, and only a sea of red mist was spread far below me. A while, and even this had gone, and I was wrapped in an impalpable, lightless gloom. A great time passed. Ages. And then a single star broke its way through the darkness. Presently, all about me shone the splendor of the countless stars. Later, years it seemed, I saw the sun, a clot of flame, and then I saw the earth again, blue and unbelievably minute. A long space of time came and went, and then at last I entered into the shadow of the world, plunging headlong into the dim and holy earth night. For a while, I knew nothing. I was unconscious. Then, gradually, I became aware of a faint, distant whining. I struggled madly for breath and tried to shout. I was conscious that something was licking my hand. Then things came back to me, and I called Pepper, faintly. I was answered by a joyful bark and renewed caresses. In a while I felt stronger and put out my hand for the matches. I struck a light and looked confusedly around me. All about me I saw the old familiar things, and I sat full of dazed wonder until the flame of the match burnt my fingers, and I dropped it. After a moment I struck another match, and stumbling across the room, lit the candles. As I did so, I observed that they had not burned away, but been put out. As the flames shot up, I stared about the study, yet there was nothing unusual to see. What had happened? I felt dazed and muddled. I went across to the cupboard where I keep brandy and biscuits and poured myself out a little of the stimulant. I drank it off, then taking a handful of biscuits, I returned to my chair and began to devour them ravenously. I was vaguely surprised at my hunger. As I ate, my glance fell upon the face of the clock in the corner. Therewith, I stopped eating and just stared. The hands were pointing to a little before midnight, whereas it was, as I well knew, considerably after that time, when I had witnessed the first of the strange happenings. For a moment I was puzzled. Then, as I turned the matter over in my wearied brain, the thought flashed upon me that it was now close upon the morning of the 22nd, and that I had been unconscious to the visible world through the greater portion of the last 24 hours. During breakfast next morning, I inquired casually of my sister regarding this date, and found my surmise correct. I had indeed been absent, at least in the spirit, for nearly a day and a night. My sister asked me no question, for it was not by any means the first time that I kept to my study for a whole day, and sometimes a couple of days, when I had been particularly engrossed in my books. And so the days pass on, and I am still filled with a wonder to know the meaning of all that I saw on that memorable night. The house is, as I have said before, surrounded by wild and uncultivated gardens. Away at the back, distant some 300 yards, is a dark, deep ravine, spoken of as the pit by the peasantry. At the bottom runs a sluggish stream, overhung by trees. In passing, I must explain that this river has a subterranean origin, emerging suddenly at the east end of the ravine and disappearing as abruptly at its western extremity. It was some months after my vision, if vision it were, of the great plain, that my attention was particularly attracted to the pit. I happened one day to be walking along its southern edge, when suddenly several pieces of rock were dislodged from the face of the cliff beneath me, and fell with a sudden crash through the trees. I heard them splash in the river at the bottom, and then silence. I should not have given the incident more than a passing thought, had not Pepper at once begun to bark savagely. Feeling that there must be something in the pit, I went back to the house for a stick. When I returned, Pepper had ceased his barks, and was growling and smelling uneasily along the top. Whistling to him to follow me, I started to descend, cautiously. The depth to the river must be about 150 feet. Once down, Pepper began to explore the banks. It was very dark there, due to the overhanging trees, and I moved warily, my stick ready. Thus we searched right up one side of the river without seeing anything. Then we crossed over and commenced to beat our way back through the underbrush. We had accomplished half the distance when I heard again the sound of stones falling on the other side. Seconds later, a loud, half-human, half-pig-like squeal sounded from among the trees halfway up the cliff. It was answered by a similar note from the bottom of the pit. At this, Pepper gave a short bark, and, springing across the river, disappeared into the bushes. Immediately afterwards, I heard his barks increase in depth and number, and in between there sounded a noise of confused jabbering. This ceased, as there rose a semi-human yell of agony, and then Pepper gave a howl of pain and came running out. As he reached me, I saw that he was bleeding from what appeared to be a great claw wound in his side. Seeing Pepper thus mutilated, a feeling of anger seized me, and whirling my staff, I sprang across and into the bushes. As I forced my way through, I thought I heard a sound of breathing. Next instant, I had burst into a clear space, just in time to see something, livid white in colour, disappear ahead of me. With a shout, I ran towards it, but though I struck and probed among the bushes with my stick, I neither saw nor heard anything further, and so returned to Pepper. There, after bathing his wound in the river, we retreated up the ravine and into the daylight again. On reaching the house, my sister inquired what had happened to Pepper, and I told her he had been fighting with the wildcat. I felt it would be better not to tell her how it had really happened. Though to be sure, I scarcely knew myself, but I did know that the thing I had seen was no wildcat. It was too big, and had, so far as I had observed, a skin like a hog's, only of a dead, unhealthy white colour, and it had run upright on its hind feet. To tell the truth, I felt a good deal of uneasiness as I turned the matter over in my mind. It was later that afternoon, as I sat reading, that happening to look up, I saw something peering over the window ledge, the eyes and ears only showing. "A pig, by Jove," I said, rising to my feet. But it was no pig. God alone knows what it was. It reminded me vaguely of that hideous thing in the great arena. It had a grotesquely human mouth and jaw, but no chin. The nose was prolonged into a snout. This, with the little eyes and ears, gave it a swine-like appearance. The face was of an unwholesome white colour. For perhaps a minute, I stood looking at the thing, with an ever-growing fear. The mouth kept jabbering inanely, and the eyes seemed to glow. It appeared to be supporting itself by two claw-like hands upon the window-sill. As my nerves steadied a little, I took a step towards the window. Even as I did so, the thing ducked and vanished. I rushed to the door and looked around, but only the tangled bushes and shrubs met my gaze. I ran back into the house and, getting my gun, sallied out to search through the gardens. I was determined to put an end to that swine thing. At first I searched cautiously, with the thought of Pepper's wound in my mind. But as the hours passed and not a sign of anything living showed in the lonely gardens, I became less apprehensive, plunging right through the bushes. For the rest of the afternoon, I searched. I felt that I should be unable to sleep with that bestial thing haunting the shrubberies, and yet, when evening fell, I had seen nothing. I turned homewards with a curious feeling of depression. That night, after my sister had gone to bed, I went round to all the windows and doors on the ground floor and saw that they were securely fastened. This precaution was scarcely necessary as regards the windows, all of which are strongly barred, but with the doors it was a wise thought, as not one was locked. Having secured these, I went to the kitchen, where a large fire was burning, and sat there. I dare say I had read for a couple of hours when suddenly I heard a sound. It was a noise of something rubbing and fumbling against the back door. Once the door creaked loudly, as though force was being applied to it. During those few moments I experienced an indescribable feeling of terror. My hands shook, a cold sweat broke out on me, and I shivered violently. And then the stealthy movements outside ceased. For an hour I sat there, silent and watchful. Gradually something stole on my ear, a sound that resolved itself into a faint murmur. Quickly it developed and grew into a muffled but hideous chorus of bestial shrieks. It appeared to rise from the bowels of the earth, and then it stopped. After that I just sat, and thus the daylight found me. I crept to the door to listen. For some minutes I stood there. Then, very gradually and cautiously, I drew back the bolt and, opening the door, peeped out. My caution was unneeded. Nothing was to be seen, save the grey vista of dreary, tangled bushes and trees extending to the distant plantation. With a shiver, I closed the door and made my way up to bed. It was evening, a week later. My sister sat in the garden, knitting. I was walking up and down, reading. My gun leant up against the wall of the house, for I had deemed it wise to take precautions. Yet through the whole week there had been nothing to alarm me, either by sight or sound. I was, as I have said, reading and somewhat engrossed in my book. Suddenly I heard a crash, away in the direction of the pit. I turned and saw a tremendous column of dust rising high in the evening air. My sister had risen to her feet in fright. Telling her to stay where she was, I snatched up my gun and ran towards the pit. As I neared it, I heard a loud, rumbling sound, and up from the pit drove a fresh volume of dust. Then the noise ceased, though the dust still rose tumultuously. I reached the edge and looked down, trying to see through the reek. At first it was impossible to make anything out. Then as I stared, I saw something below to my left that moved. I looked intently towards it, and presently made out another, two dim shapes that appeared to be climbing up the side of the pit. I leant forward and peered over, and saw no more than a hideous white swine face that had risen up within a couple of yards of my feet. Below it I could make out several others. As the thing saw me, it gave an uncouth squeal, which was answered from all parts of the pit. At that, A gust of horror took me, and I discharged my gun right in its face. It disappeared with the clatter of loose earth and stones. Then I heard a quick patter of many feet, and turning, I saw a troop of these creatures coming towards me at a run. Instantly, I raised my gun and fired at the foremost, who plunged headlong with a hideous howling. Then I turned and ran. As I approached the house, I saw my sister coming towards me. She had heard the shooting. "Run!" I shouted. "Run for your life!" Without more ado, she turned and fled. As I followed, I gave a glance behind. The brutes were running on their hind legs, at times dropping on all fours. Ahead, I could see the back door. Luckily, it was open. I was some half-dozen yards behind Mary now, and my breath was sobbing in my throat. Then something touched my shoulder. I turned and saw one of those monstrous pallid faces close to mine. With a sudden effort, I swung my gun by the barrel and brought it crashing down upon the creature's head. The thing dropped with an almost human groan. Even this short delay had been nearly sufficient to bring the rest of the brutes down upon me, and I turned and ran. Reaching the house, I burst into the passage, then slammed the door, just as the first of the creatures rushed against it. My sister sat gasping in a chair. She seemed in a fainting condition, but I had no time to spend on her. I had to make sure that all the doors were fastened. Fortunately, they were. The one leading from my study to the garden was the last I checked, and I could hear something scratching on the panels. Evidently, some of the brutes were feeling with their claw hands to discover a means of ingress. That the creatures should so soon have found the door assured me that they must not be regarded by any means as mere animals. Now I bethought me of my sister, and going to the cupboard, I got out a flask of brandy. Taking it with me, I went down to the kitchen. She had fallen from the chair and was lying upon the floor. I raised her head somewhat and poured a little of the brandy between her lips. After a while, she gave several gasps and opened her eyes. And then she gave a loud scream and, scrambling to her feet, ran from the room. I was utterly puzzled and astonished. Could she be afraid of me? But why? I could only conclude that her nerves were badly shaken and that she was temporarily unhinged. By this time, it had grown quite dark, and there came all the varied creaks and groans of which an old house is so full after nightfall. But gradually, the sounds grew on my nerves to such an extent that I decided to make the rounds of the basement again, and if anything were there, face it. Taking the kitchen lamp down from its hook, I made my way from cellar to cellar, and room to room, through pantry and coal hole, along passages and alleys that formed the basement of the old house. As I entered the buttery, I heard a movement, but the place seemed empty. I was about to leave it, convinced that I had been mistaken, when my light flashed back from two bright spots outside the window. For a few moments I stood there staring. I knew that they were eyes. Slowly I traced the shadowy outline of one of the things. It appeared to be holding onto the bars of the window. I went nearer and held the light higher. There was no need to be afraid of the creature. The window bars were strong. Yet I felt a horrible sensation of fear. I realized dimly that the creature's eyes were looking into mine with a steady, compelling stare. I tried to turn away, but could not. I seemed now to see the window through a mist. My head began to swim and throb violently. Then I was aware of a feeling of pain in my left hand. With a tremendous effort, I glanced down. I realized then that I had, in my agitation, unconsciously caught hold of the hot lamp glass and burnt my hand. I looked up to the window again. The misty appearance had gone, and now I saw that it was crowded with dozens of bestial faces. With a sudden rage, I raised the lamp and hurled it at the window. It struck the glass, smashing a pane, and passed between two of the bars into the garden, scattering burning oil as it went. I heard several loud cries of pain, and the creatures disappeared. Pulling myself together, I groped for the door and made my way upstairs. Reaching my study, I lit the candles. Then I crossed the room to the rifle stand. I selected a heavy rifle and ammunition, and then made my way up into one of the small towers with which the house is crowned. In the darkness, the gardens presented a blur of shadows. I sat still and listened. Only an occasional grunt or squeal came up to me. Eventually the moon's light rose over the trees, and I could view the gardens below. Even then, I could see none of the brutes. Until, happening to crane forward, I saw several of them lying up against the side of the house. What they were doing I could not make out, but taking aim, I fired at the one directly beneath. There was a shrill scream, and as the smoke cleared, I saw that it was lying on its back. The others had disappeared. Immediately after this, there came a long squeal from the pit. At once, the garden was filled with answering cries. As I looked over the parapet, it seemed as though the shrubberies were alive. They tossed hither and thither, while a continuous noise of scampering feet rose up to me. Several times I saw the moonlight gleam on running white figures among the bushes, and twice I fired. The second time, my shot was answered by a squeal of pain. A minute later, the gardens lay quiet. From the pit came the babel of swine talk. At times, angry cries smote the air. It occurred to me that they were holding some kind of council of war. I decided that now would be a good time to make a final survey of our defenses. This I proceeded to do at once, examining each of the solid oak doors in the basement. Then I went upstairs to the study. I was more anxious about this door, that opens onto a raised lawn at the side of the house. It is of more modern make than the others, and is of lighter construction. I spent some time puzzling how to strengthen it. Finally, I went to the kitchen and brought up several heavy pieces of timber. These I wedged slantwise against the door, nailing them top and bottom. For half an hour I worked hard, and at last got it shored to my satisfaction. Then, feeling easier, I proceeded to attend to one or two matters before returning to the tower. It was whilst thus employed that I heard a fumbling at the door, and the latch was tried. Keeping silence, I waited. I heard the creatures grunting to one another softly. Then suddenly there was a quick, low grunt, and the door creaked under a tremendous pressure. It would have burst inwards but for the supports I had placed. The strain ceased, and there was more talk. Instantly, for it was no time to hesitate, I grabbed my rifle and ran up the stairs. This time it was not to one of the towers that I went, but to the flat leaded roof itself. Once there, I raced across to the parapet and leaned over, looked down. As I did so, I heard the short, grunted signal and caught the crying of the door under assault. I aimed quickly and fired. From below rose a shrill wail, and the door ceased its groaning. Then, as I took my weight from off the parapet, a huge piece of the coping stone slid from beneath me and fell with a crash among the disorganized throng beneath. Several horrible shrieks quavered through the night air, and I heard a sound of scampering feet. Cautiously, I looked over. In the moonlight I could see the great coping stone lying across the threshold of the door. I thought I saw something under it. Several things. White. And so a few minutes passed. As I stared, a creature came out from the shadow of the house. It went up to the stone and bent down. When it stood up, it had something in its talons, which it put into its mouth. I loaded my rifle and pulled the trigger. The brute fell to the ground. I made my way down to the study. I was anxious to see how the door had withstood the test of the last assault. Entering, I saw that one of the large props had been displaced, and that the door had been forced inward some 6 inches. There and then, I set to at repairing it with another plank. Then, after pouring myself a little brandy, I returned to the tower to watch. It was now about 3 a.m., and presently the eastern sky began to pale with the coming of dawn. As day came, I scanned the gardens earnestly, but nowhere could I see any sign of the brutes. I leant over and glanced down at the foot of the wall. The body of the thing I had shot the night before was gone. Then I went down onto the roof and looked over from where the coping stone had fallen. Yes, there was the stone, as I had last seen it. But there was no appearance of anything beneath it, nor could I see the creature I had killed. Evidently, the bodies had been taken away. I turned and went down to my study. There I sat down wearily. I was thoroughly tired. A clock chimed the hour of 4. I awoke with a start and looked around. The clock in the corner indicated it was 3 o'clock. It was already afternoon. I must have slept for nearly 11 hours. With a jerky movement, I sat forward in the chair and listened. The house seemed perfectly silent. Slowly I stood up and yawned. Then there was a sudden noise of steps in the corridor. In an instant I grasped my rifle. Noiselessly I waited. Had the creatures broken in whilst I slept? Even as I questioned, the steps reached my door, halted momentarily, and then continued along the passage. Silently I tiptoed to the doorway and peeped out. With relief, I saw my sister. She was going towards the stairs. I was about to call her when it occurred to me that it was very queer she should have crept past my door in that stealthy manner. I was puzzled, but then I remembered her condition of mind on the previous day and decided to follow and see what she was going to do. Quickly, I reached the head of the stairs and paused a moment. Then I heard a sound that sent me leaping down at a mad rate. It was the rattle of bolts being unshot. That foolish sister of mine was actually unbarring the back door. Just as her hand was on the last bolt, I reached her and grabbed her arm. She glanced up quickly, like a frightened animal, and then screamed aloud. "Mary, what's the meaning of this nonsense? Don't tell me that you don't understand the danger." To this, she replied nothing, only trembled violently, gasping and sobbing. Through some minutes, I reasoned with her, pointing out the need for caution and asking her to be brave. I asked her to be sensible and not attempt to leave the house for a few days. At last, I ceased in despair. It was no use talking to her. She was obviously not quite herself for the time being. I told her she had better go to her room. Still, she took no notice, so without more ado I picked her up in my arms and carried her there. At first she screamed wildly, but had relapsed into silent trembling by the time I laid her upon her bed. She was quiet enough, neither speaking nor sobbing, just shaking in a very ague of fear. I took a rug from a chair and spread it over her. I could do nothing more, and so crossed to where Pepper lay in his basket. My sister had nursed him since his wound, and I was pleased to note that in spite of her state of mind, she had looked after the old dog carefully. Stooping, I spoke to him, and he licked my hand. He was too ill to do more. The rest of the day I spent between the tower and my study. For food, I brought up a loaf from the pantry, and on this and some claret I lived for that day. What a long, weary day it was. As the evening drew on, I made preparations for spending a second night in the tower, taking up 2 additional rifles and a heavy ulster. After that, I made the round of the house again, paying particular attention to the props on the study door. Then, feeling that I had done all that lay in my power to ensure our safety, I returned to the tower. Slowly the hours passed, without anything unusual happening, and the moon rose, showing the gardens apparently empty and silent. Towards morning, I began to grow stiff and cold with my long vigil. Also, I was uneasy concerning the continued quietness of the creatures. Once or twice, the thought came to me that perhaps they had gone, but in my heart, I found it impossible to believe that it was so. At last, I resolved to take a walk through the house, first calling in at the study for a glass of brandy to warm me. This I did, and while there, I examined the door carefully, but found all as I had left it the night before. The day was just breaking, but it was still dark in the house, and I took one of the study candles with me on my way round. But everything appeared to be in order, and I was on the point of extinguishing my candle when I thought to have another glance around the cellars. It is in the smallest of these places that I keep my wine, close to the cellar stairs, and beyond which I have seldom proceeded. Indeed, save for the rummage around already mentioned, I doubt whether I have ever before been right through the place. I unlocked the door at the top of the stairs and stood and listened. All was silent, save for a faint drip, drip of water. Quietly, I made my way from cellar to cellar. I had but a very dim memory of their arrangement, a succession of cellars, and of one greater than the rest. I moved nervously through them, until I came at last to the great cellar that I remembered. It is reached through a large arch, on which I observed strange, fantastic carvings. It occurred to me how strange it was that I should be so little acquainted with my own house. Yet this may be easily understood when one realizes the size of this ancient pile, and the fact that only my sister and I live in it, occupying few rooms, such as our wants decide. Holding the light high, I walked cautiously about, but so far as the light showed, I saw nothing unusual. About halfway up the cellar, I stubbed my foot against something that gave a metallic sound. Stooping quickly, I saw that I had kicked a large metal ring. I had cleared the dust from around it and discovered that it was attached to a trapdoor, black with age. Feeling excited and wondering where it could lead, I put my gun and candle on the floor, took the ring in both hands, and pulled. The trap creaked loudly, and then opened. Propping the edge on my knee, I reached for the candle and held it in the opening, but could see nothing. There were no signs of steps, nothing, save an empty blackness. Then, even as I stared, full of perplexity, I seemed to hear, far down, a faint whisper of sound. I bent my head and listened intently. It may have been my fancy, but I could have sworn to hearing a soft titter that grew into a hideous chuckling, faint and distant. Startled, I let the trap fall with a hollow clang that filled the place with echoes. For a full minute I stood there, quivering, glancing nervously behind and before. But the great cellar was as silent as a grave, and gradually I shook off the frightened sensation. One thing I felt, however, was that the trap ought to be secured. This I accomplished by placing upon it several large pieces of stone which lay by the wall. Then, after a final scrutiny of the rest of the place, I returned to the steps, and so reached the daylight, with an infinite feeling of relief. The sun was now warm and shining brightly, and it was with comparatively light feelings that I made my way up to the tower to survey the gardens. There I found everything quiet, and after a few minutes went down to Mary's room. My sister was sitting on the bed. She seemed quite herself again, and made no attempt to move away as I approached her. Yet I observed that she scanned my face anxiously, as though in doubt and but half assured that there was nothing to fear from me. To my questions as to how she felt, she replied that she was hungry and would like to go down to prepare breakfast. I told her she might go, on condition that she did not meddle with any of the outer doors. At my mention of the doors, a sudden look of fright crossed her face, but she said nothing, and then left the room. Crossing the floor, I approached Pepper. He had wakened as I entered, but beyond a slight yelp of pleasure and a soft rapping with his tail, had kept quiet. I was greatly delighted with this improvement, and after a while went down to my study. In a little time, Mary appeared, carrying a tray on which smoked a hot breakfast. As she entered the room, I saw her gaze fasten on the props that supported the study door. Her lips tightened. "Come, Mary," I said. "Cheer up. Things look brighter. I've seen none of the creatures since yesterday morning." She looked at me in a curiously puzzled manner, and then fear swept into her eyes. But she said nothing beyond an unintelligible murmur of acquiescence. Breakfast over, I returned to the tower. Here, during the greater part of the day, I maintained a strict watch over the gardens. Once or twice I went down to see how my sister was getting along, but I refrained from discussing my vigil. It was evident that any reference to the swine things was more than her shaken nerves could bear. That night I slept in a bed, the first time for 2 nights. In the morning I rose early and took a walk through the house. All was as it should be, and I went up to the tower to have a look at the garden. Here again I found perfect quietness. At breakfast I was greatly pleased to see that Mary seemed to have recovered. She talked sensibly and quietly, only keeping carefully from any mention of the last couple of days. During the day I kept on the alert, spending much of my time in the tower. It would soon be 3 days since I had seen any of the things, but still I intended to use utmost caution. For all that I could tell, this protracted silence might be a ruse to tempt me from the house, perhaps right into their arms. I made no attempt to leave. On the 6th day, I had the pleasure of seeing Pepper once more upon his feet, and though still weak, he managed to keep me company for the whole of the day. How slowly the time went, and never a thing to indicate that any of the brutes still infested the gardens. It was on the 9th day that, finally, I decided to run the risk, if any there were, and sally out. With this purpose in view, I loaded one of the shotguns. Then, after making a careful scrutiny of the grounds from the tower, I called Pepper to follow me, and made my way outside. Pepper ran ahead, sniffing as he went. At times he stopped to investigate, a bullet hole in the pathway, or a piece of torn sod. I observed him critically as he went along, and could discover nothing of uneasiness in his demeanour. By this I was assured that the gardens were empty, at least for the present, of those hateful things. Reaching the place where I had shot the first creature, I made a careful scrutiny, but could see nothing. From there, I went on to where the great coping stone had fallen. It lay on its side, half in and half out of the ground. I looked at it closely. I had seen several of the brutes struck down beneath it, and now not a vestige of them was to be seen, not even a blood stain. I felt puzzled as I turned the matter over in my mind, but I could think of no plausible explanation, and after looking around the surrounding gardens, I set off for the pit. On the way, I kept a sharp outlook, holding my gun in readiness. But Pepper was running ahead, I noticed, without any apparent hesitation. From this I augured that there was no imminent danger to be apprehended, and I followed quickly in his wake. He had reached the top of the pit now, and was nosing his way along the edge. A minute later I was beside him, looking down into the pit. For a moment I could scarcely believe that it was the same place, so greatly was it changed. The dark, wooded ravine of a fortnight ago, with a foliage-hidden stream at the bottom, no longer existed. Instead, my eyes showed me a ragged chasm, partly filled with a gloomy lake of turbid water. A little to my left, the side of the pit appeared to have collapsed altogether, forming a deep V-shaped cleft in the cliff. This rift ran from the upper edge of the ravine nearly down to the water, and penetrated into the pit side to a distance of some 40 feet. But what attracted my attention, more than even the stupendous split itself, was a great hole right in the angle of the V. It was not unlike an arched doorway. My first impression that there had been a landslip was, I began to see, not sufficient to account for all the changes I witnessed. And the water. I turned suddenly, for I could hear the noise of running water. I could see nothing, but it seemed to come from somewhere at the east end of the pit. Slowly I made my way in that direction, the sound growing plainer, until I stood right above it. Thrusting my head over the cliff, I saw below me a torrent of water issuing from a fissure in the pit side into the lake beneath. A little further along I saw several others. These, then, would help to account for the water in the pit, especially if the fall of rock had blocked the outlet to the stream. Yet I puzzled my head to account for the generally shaken appearance of the place, that huge cleft further up the ravine. I could imagine an earthquake or a great explosion creating such conditions, but of these there had been neither. Slowly, and keeping a careful watch in all directions, I made a circuit of the pit, but found little else that I had not already seen. For a while longer I loitered about, keeping my eyes and ears open, but still without seeing or hearing anything suspicious. All this while, Pepper had shown no signs of uneasiness. So far as I could see, his attention had been taken with sniffing among the grass at the edge of the pit. At times, he would leave the edge and run along towards the house as though following invisible tracks, but in all cases, returning after a few minutes. I had but little doubt that he was tracing out the footsteps of the swine things, and the fact that each one seemed to lead him back to the pit appeared to me proof that the brutes had all returned to whence they came.
This video was uploaded to the channel Thinking Out Louder. Please like, comment and subscribe to the Thinking Out Louder channel. Thank you.
Another week came and went, during which I spent a great deal of my time about the pit mouth. I had come to the conclusion that the arched hole was where the swine things had made their exit from some unholy place in the bowels of the world. I was tremendously curious to know where the hole led, though so far the idea had not struck me of making an investigation. I was far too much imbued with a sense of horror of the creatures to risk contact with them. But as the days slid by, my fear of the swine things became an emotion of the past, more an incredible memory than aught else. Thus, a day came when I procured a rope from the house, and having made it fast to a tree on the pit edge, let the other end drop down into the cleft. Then I climbed slowly down until I reached the hole. I stood and peered in. All was dark, and not a sound came to me. Yet a moment later, it seemed I could hear something. I held my breath and listened, but all was silent as the grave, and I breathed freely once more, and then I heard the sound again. It was like the noise of laboured breathing. As I stood there, petrified, my foot dislodged a pebble, which fell into the dark with a hollow chink. At once the noise was taken up and repeated a score of times, each succeeding echo being fainter. Then, as the silence fell again, I heard that stealthy breathing. But now I no longer feared. I knew that the strange sounds were not made by any lurking swine creatures, but were simply the echo of my own respirations. But I had received such a fright that I was far too shaken to think of entering that dark hole then, and so I returned to the house. By the following day, the water in the pit had risen even more. I realized that unless I carried out my investigation soon, the opening would be submerged. And so a day later saw me standing at the top of the cleft, fully equipped for the task. I had brought, in addition to the rope, a bundle of candles and my shotgun. As before, I fastened the rope to the tree. Then, having tied my gun across my shoulders, I lowered myself over the edge of the pit. At this movement, Pepper, who had been eyeing my actions, barked in warning. But I was resolved on my enterprise, and bade him lie down. Reaching the entrance, I let go the rope and untied my shotgun. Then, with a last look at the sky, which I noticed was clouding over rapidly, I went forward into the passage and lit one of the candles. Holding it above my head, I began to move on slowly, throwing my glances in all directions. The path trended downwards and to the left in the direction of the house. Very cautiously, I progressed forward, stopping every few steps to listen. I had gone perhaps 100 yards when, suddenly, it seemed to me that I heard a faint sound behind me. With my heart thudding heavily, I listened. I could hear it distinctly now, the soft padding of running feet. I backed against the rocky wall and, holding the candle above my head, waited, gun in hand. Seconds later, 2 eyes reflected back from the gloom the rays of my candle. I raised my gun and aimed. Even as I did so, something leapt out of the darkness with a blustering bark of joy that woke the echoes like thunder. It was Pepper. He was dripping wet. I concluded that he must have tried to follow me and fallen into the water. But I was curiously glad to have the old fellow with me. He was company, and somehow I felt less afraid. For some minutes we proceeded slowly along, the path still leading straight towards the house. But then I stopped and held the light high, and reason enough I had to be thankful that I did so, for there, not 3 paces forward, the path vanished into a hollow blackness. Very cautiously I peered down, but could see nothing. I crossed to the left of the passage. Here, against the wall, was a narrow track, some 3 feet wide, that led onward. Carefully, I followed it. On one side, the solid, unyielding rock, and on the other, a yawning chasm. Gradually, I noticed that the path trended steadily to the right, and I discovered that I was not going forward, but simply circling the huge abyss. I had evidently come to the end of the passage. 5 minutes later, I stood on the spot from which I had started, having been completely round what I now guessed to be a vast pit. I picked up a rock and hurled it into the chasm. Then I stepped forward and listened, but though I kept perfectly quiet for at least a full minute, no sound came back to me from the dark. I knew then the depth of the hole must be immense. I lit several more candles, and putting them on the edge, I tried to get some dim sight of the place, but they were totally insufficient for my purpose. And then Pepper gave a sudden howl that was taken up by the echoes and repeated with ghastly variations, dying away slowly. At the same moment, I seemed to hear a noise like a diabolical chuckle rise up from the depths below. I started. Then I recollected that it was probably the echo of Pepper's howl. Pepper moved away from me, nosing along the rocky floor. I went towards him, holding the candle low, and as I moved, I heard my boots go sop, sop. From somewhere along the passage, a stream of water was running in the direction of the great opening. And then I heard a murmurous roar that grew louder and filled the whole cavern with a deafening sound. I had sprung to one side, and turning, saw a great wall of foam sweep past me and leap tumultuously into the waiting chasm. After the first rush, the flow of water eased, but a short examination showed me that the water reached right across the passage and was running at a tremendous rate. It was evident that I must make my exit as hurriedly as possible. The noise of the water was deafening, but with a call to Pepper, I stepped out into the flood, using the gun as a staff. Instantly, the water boiled up over my knees. It was all I could do to keep my legs. Pepper managed a great deal better than I did, going ahead of me like a guide and helping me to break the force of the water. On we went, struggling and gasping, until about 100 yards had been safely traversed. Then, suddenly, I slipped. Instantly, the water leapt over me in a cataract, hurling me down towards that bottomless hole. I was helpless, gasping and drowning. But all at once something gripped my coat. It was Pepper. Missing me, he must have raced back to find me and then caught and held me until I was able to get to my feet. I have a dim recollection of having seen momentarily the gleams of lights, but of this I have never been quite sure. Of course, the lights could have been the distant flames of the candles I have left burning, but as I have said, I am by no means sure. My eyes were full of water, and I had been badly shaken. There was I, without my gun, without light, with the water deepening, depending solely upon old Pepper to help me out of that hellish place. My faithful Pepper led me, dragged me, upward and onward, until at last I saw a gleam of blessed light. It was the entrance. Only a few yards further, and I reached the opening, with the water surging hungrily around my loins. And now I understood the cause of the catastrophe. It was raining heavily, literally in torrents. This had caused the premature rise in the level of the lake. Luckily, the rope by which I had descended was streaming into the opening. Seizing the end, I knotted it around Pepper's body, then, summoning up the last of my strength, I climbed up the side of the cliff. I reached the edge in the last stage of exhaustion. Yet I had to make one more effort and haul Pepper to safety. I have but a very hazy remembrance of the end. I recall pulling through moments that lagged strangely. I have also some recollection of seeing Pepper's muzzle appearing over the pit edge. Then all grew suddenly black. I suppose I must have swooned, for the next thing I remember, I opened my eyes and all was dusk. I was lying on my back, and Pepper was licking my ears. Eventually, I managed to stand up and make my way back towards the house. How I reached there, I scarcely know, and of the days that followed I remember still less. When I recovered my senses, it was to find that I had been in bed for 2 weeks. Yet another passed before I was strong enough to totter out into the gardens. It was a couple of days later that I managed to get to the pit. There I found that in my week's absence there had been wrought a wondrous change. Instead of a 3 parts filled ravine, I looked out upon a great lake, whose placid surface reflected the light coldly. The water had risen to within a few feet of the pit edge. Only in one part was the lake disturbed, and that was the area above the entrance to the vast underground pit. Here there was a continuous bubbling. As I stood there, it came to me how wonderfully things had worked out. The entrance to the place whence the swine creatures had come was sealed up by a power that made me feel there was nothing more to fear from them. Back in the house, I thought to pay a visit to the great vault where the trapdoor is situated. Reaching the place, I approached slowly. There it was, with the stones piled upon it, just as I had last seen it. I had the lantern with me, and it seemed that now would be a good time to investigate whatever lay under the great oak slab. Placing the lantern on the floor, I tumbled the stones off the trap and pulled the door open. As I did so, the cellar became filled with the sound of a murmurous thunder that rose from far below. A moist wind and spray drove into my eyes, blurring my vision. I felt into my pockets for a piece of twine with which to lower the lantern into the opening. Even as I fumbled, the lantern slipped from my fingers and hurtled down into the darkness. For a brief instant I watched its fall and saw the light shine on a tumult of white foam, some 100 feet below me. Then it was gone. I now knew the cause of the wet and noise. The great cellar was connected with the pit by means of the trap which opened right above it. And I had an explanation for that chuckle that sounded the first time I'd opened the trap. Evidently, some of the swine things had been right beneath me. Another thought struck me. Were all the creatures drowned? Would they drown? Had they life as we understand it? Or were they ghouls? I closed the trapdoor. Then I piled the stones back upon it and made my way upstairs. After this time, I had serious thoughts of leaving this house, and might have done so but for the wonderful thing that happened. How well I was advised in my heart when I stayed on here, in spite of those visions and sights of unexplainable things. For had I not stayed, then I would not have seen again the face of her that I loved and lost. I would write down the story of those sweet old days, but it would be like the tearing of old wounds. But now she has come to me, out of the unknown. Strangely, she warned me about this house, begged me to leave it, but admitted when I questioned her that she could not have come to me had I been elsewhere. Yet still she warned me earnestly, telling me that it was a place long ago given to evil. It was thus that I came to the place of the Sea of Sleep, so she termed it. I had stayed up in my study, reading, and must have dozed over the book. Suddenly, I awoke with a start. For a moment I looked round with the puzzled sense of something unusual. There was a misty look about the room. The flames of the candle shone through it palely at first, but gradually it increased, and soon I could see nothing. I cannot tell how long a space thus passed, but after a while I became aware that I was standing on the shore of an immense and silent sea. Overhead, the sky was of a uniform grey colour, the whole place being lit by a stupendous globe of pale fire that swam above the horizon. Beyond the gentle murmur of the sea, an intense stillness prevailed. Then, as I stood there, it seemed that a bubble of white foam floated up out of the depths, and then, even now, I know not how it was, I was looking upon the face of her, and she looked back at me with such a commingling of joy and sadness that I ran towards her blindly, crying strangely to her, in a very agony of remembrance, of terror, and of hope, to come to me. Yet in spite of my crying, she stayed out there upon the sea, and only shook her head sorrowfully. But in her eyes was the old earth-light of tenderness that I had come to know before all things ere we were parted. I grew desperate, and essayed to wade out to her, yet though I would, I could not. Some invisible barrier held me back. "Oh, my darling, I cried. And at that she came over swiftly and touched me, and it was as though heaven had opened. Yet when I reached out my hands to her, she put me from her tenderly with stern hands, and I was abashed. Through tears, the noise of eternity in my ears, we parted. She whom I love. Oh, my God! I was a great time dazed, and then I was alone in the blackness of the night. I knew that I had journeyed back once more to the known universe. And now I come to the strangest of all the strange happenings that have befallen me in this house of mysteries. It was night, about 11 o'clock. Pepper and I kept one another company in the study. I was reading, curiously enough, the Bible. I have begun in these later days to take a growing interest in that great book. Suddenly, a distinct tremor shook the house, and there came a distant, whirring buzz. I looked across at Pepper. He was sleeping peacefully. Gradually, the whirring noise decreased, and there came a long silence. All at once, a glow lit up the end window. I walked across the room and pulled aside the blind. As I did so, I saw the sun rise from behind the horizon. It rose with a steady, perceptible movement. I could see it travel upwards. Up it went. It was broad daylight now. Behind me, I was conscious of a sharp, mosquito-like buzzing. I glanced around at the clock. Even as I looked, the hour hand moved quickly from space to space. I had a dumb sense of astonishment. I saw now that the sun had risen high into the heavens and was still visibly moving. As the window came into shadow, I saw another extraordinary thing. The fine weather clouds were floating across the sky. They were scampering, as though 100 miles an hour wind blew. To the west, I saw the sun drop with an incredible smooth, swift motion. Quickly, the room began to darken. The sun disappeared from my sight, almost with a jerk. The evening seemed to merge into an almost instant night. About this time, the buzzing in the corner ceased, telling me that the clock had run down. No more than a few heartbeats, and the sun rose swiftly, and there seemed to come a strange acceleration. It made one clean, clear sweep through the sky and disappeared behind the western horizon, and night came and went like haste. Faster and faster spun the world, and now each day and night was completed within the space of but a few seconds, and still the speed increased. Once I turned from the window and glanced at Pepper. In the flash of a day, I saw that he slept quietly. Presently, feeling lonely and distraught, I called to him, but he took no notice. I called again. Still he moved not. I walked over to where he lay and touched him with my foot to rouse him. At the action, gentle though it was, he crumbled into a mouldering heap of bones and dust. For a minute I stood, stunned. Then, as I stirred the heap with my foot, it occurred to me that this could only happen in a great space of time, years and years. I tried to understand what it meant, but I could not think coherently. I glanced around the room, and now for the first time noticed how dusty and old the place looked. Dust and dirt everywhere, piled in little heaps in the corners, and spread out upon the furniture. Quickly, but with steps that I noticed for the first time tottered, I went across the room to the great pier glass and looked in. It too was covered with grime, and with trembling hands I began to rub off the dirt. Presently I could see myself. Instead of the great, hale man who scarcely looked 50, I was looking at a bent, decrepit figure whose shoulders stooped and whose face was wrinkled with the years of a century. I turned away. How tired I felt. I wondered about my sister. Was she dead as well as Pepper? All had happened so quickly and suddenly. This must be indeed the beginning of the end of all things. It occurred to me to go and look for her, but I felt too weary. I moved slowly to the window. Quickly, and ever quicker, ran the flicker of day and night, and suddenly it seemed I was aware that the flicker had died out, and instead there reigned a comparatively steady light, which was shed upon all the world, from an eternal river of flame that swung up and down, north and south, in stupendous, mighty swings. Time fled, and the weariness that was mine grew insupportable. I turned from the window and saw my old chair. The thought of sitting in it brought a faint sense of comfort to my bewildered wretchedness. I sat down and closed my eyes. Once or twice, as though coming through thick mists, I heard noises, faintly. Then I must have slept. I awoke with a start. For a moment I wondered where I was. Then memory came to me. But I felt refreshed, and the weariness had left me. Suddenly it struck me, with a sort of grotesque seriousness, that I was still alive. I thought of Pepper, and wondered how it was that I had not followed his fate. I was alive, hundreds and thousands of centuries after my rightful period of years. I glanced around the room. It seemed different, strangely, utterly different. Then I knew what made it appear so strange. It was bare. There was not a piece of furniture in the room. I realized that this was but the inevitable end of the process of decay. Thousands of years. Over the floor was spread a deep layer of dust that reached halfway up to the window seat. It had grown immeasurably while I slept, and represented the dust of untold ages. My gaze rested thoughtfully upon where once had stood my chair, and there in its place I made out a long undulation rounded with heavy dust. I knew, and shivered at the knowledge, that it was a human body, ages dead, lying there beneath the place where I had slept. The body, under that shroud of dust, was my own dead shell. I did not attempt to prove it. I knew it now, and wondered why I had not known it all along. I was a bodiless thing. A while I stood trying to adjust my thoughts to this new problem. In time, how many thousands of years I know not, I attained some degree of quietude. I grew gradually more collected, while the world slipped across the centuries into the future. It might have been 1,000,000 years later that I perceived, beyond possibility of doubt, that the fiery sheet that lit the world was indeed darkening. Another vast space went by, and the whole enormous flame had sunk to a deeper copper color. The sun was dying. Of that there could be little doubt. And still the earth whirled onward through space and all the eons. At this time I remembered wondering how much longer the house would stand. Also, I queried to myself whether I should be doomed to stay bodiless upon the earth forever. An indefinite period passed, and it seemed that the arc of fire became less sharply defined. Presently, as I watched, the smooth outward flow ceased, and I was able to perceive that there came a momentary but irregular darkening of the world. This grew, until once more night descended in short but periodic intervals upon the wearying earth. Longer and longer became the nights, and the days equaled them. Gradually, days and nights lengthened out until they equaled a space somewhat less than one of the old earth hours. About this time, I found myself able once more to see the gardens, for the world had now grown very still and changeless. Yet there were no gardens, nothing that I knew or recognized. In place thereof, I looked out upon a vast plain stretching away into the distance, and always there reigned an incredible death silence and desolation, the immutable, awful quiet of a dying world. Silently, years moved on, and there grew up within my mind a great and overwhelming distress of uneasiness. I felt that I must fight against it, and, hoping to distract my thoughts, I looked up towards the north, in search of the nebulous whiteness which still I believed to be the far and misty glowing of the universe we had left. Even as I raised my eyes, I was thrilled with a feeling of wonder, for the hazy light had resolved into a single great star of vivid green. Slowly but surely the star grew upon my vision. With increased size, its color became more impressive, reminding me of a huge emerald, scintillating rays of fire across the void. Years fled away in silence, and the green star grew into a great splash of flame in the sky. An instant, it seemed, and the sun had vanished. Then the earth moved into the black shadow of the sun, and all was night, black, starless, and intolerable. Filled with tumultuous thoughts, I watched across the night, waiting. Years it may have been, and then in the dark house behind me, the clotted stillness of the world was broken. I seemed to hear a soft padding of many feet. A faint, inarticulate whisper of sound grew on my sense. I looked around into the blackness and saw a multitude of eyes. As I stared, they appeared to come towards me. For an instant I stood, unable to move. Then a hideous swine noise rose up. into the night, and at that I leapt from the window. I have a confused notion of having run a while, and after that I just waited. Waited. Several times I heard shrieks, but always as though from a distance. Time moved onward. I was conscious of little save a sensation of cold and hopelessness and fear. An age, it seemed, and there came a glow that told of the coming light. It grew tardily. Then the first ray from the green star struck over the edge of the dark sun and lit the world. It fell upon a great ruined structure some 200 yards away. It was the house. Staring, I saw a fearsome sight. Over its walls crawled a legion of unholy things, almost covering the old building. They were the swine creatures. Years appeared to pass slowly. The earth had almost reached the center of the sun's disk. The light from the green sun, as it must now be called, gave the old house the appearance of being wrapped in green flames. The swine creatures still crawled about the walls. Suddenly, there was a loud roar of swine voices, and up from the center of the roofless house shot a vast column of blood-red flame. I saw the towers flash with fire, a blazing furnace of red and green. Fascinated, I watched, until an overwhelming sense of coming danger drew my attention. I glanced up, and at once it was borne upon me that the sun was closer. So close, in fact, that it seemed to overhang the world. Then, I know not how, I was caught up into strange heights, floating like a bubble in the awful effulgence. Far below me, I saw the earth, with the burning house in a mountain of flame. Round about it, the ground appeared to be glowing, as though the world was becoming ignited from that one plague spot of fire. The swine things appeared quite unharmed. Then the ground seemed to cave in suddenly, and the house, with its load of foul creatures, disappeared into the depths of the earth, sending up a strange blood-colored cloud. In a while I looked around. The huge bulk of the sun rose high above me. Suddenly, the earth appeared to shoot forward towards the sun. I heard no sound, but out from the sun's face gushed a tongue of dazzling flame. It seemed to leap almost to the green sun, shearing through the emerald light, a very cataract of blinding fire. It reached its limit and sank. And on the sun glowed a vast splash of burning white, the grave of the earth. For a while, many thoughts crowded my mind, so that I was able to do aught save stare blindly before me. But when I came out of my bewilderment, I saw so extraordinary a sight that for a while I could scarcely believe it. Out of the raining green had grown a boundless river of soft, shimmering globes, each one enfolded in a wondrous fleece of pure cloud. They moved past me, continually, floating onward at no great speed. At times I seemed to distinguish faces amid the cloudiness, but strangely indistinct, as though partly real. For a long time I waited with a growing sense of content. I no longer had a feeling of unutterable loneliness, but felt rather that I was less alone than I had been for kalpas of years. Then I was borne silently towards one of the passing globes. An instant, then I slid through into the interior. For a short while I could see nothing. Then I became aware that a sound broke the stillness. It was like the murmur of a great sea breathing in its sleep. Gradually, the mist began to thin away, and so in time my vision dwelt once again upon the silent surface of the sea of sleep. I glanced round. There was the great globe of pale fire, swimming, as I had seen it before, a short distance from the horizon. I was filled with an overwhelming feeling of surprise and joy, and shaken expectancy, conceiving it possible that I might see my love again. And then I was conscious that something had touched me. I turned quickly. God, thou wert indeed gracious. It was she. She looked up into my eyes with an eager longing, and I looked down to her with all my soul. Then out of the mist her whisper came to me, soft as the rustle of a passing cloud. "Dearest." In a moment, I held her to me. How long our souls lay in the arms of joy I cannot say, but all at once I was waked from my happiness by a diminution of the pale and gentle light that lit the sea of sleep. I turned towards the huge white orb with a premonition of trouble. Black shadows were sweeping across it. It was thus that the darkness had come before our last parting. I turned to my love and noticed how wan and unreal she had grown. Her voice seemed to come from a distance. In a brief space, already half of the immense globe was shrouded. A feeling of depression seized me. Was she about to leave me, as she had gone before? I questioned her, anxiously, frightenedly, and she, nestling closer, explained in a faraway voice that it was imperative she should leave me before the sun of darkness, so she termed it, blotted out the light. At this confirmation of my fears, I was overcome with despair. How swiftly the darkness spread across the face of the white orb, yet in reality the time must have been long, beyond human comprehension. At last, only a crescent of pale fire lit the now dim sea of sleep. All this while she had held me, but now she pushed me from her tenderly. "I may not stay longer, dear one." It ended in a sob. She seemed to float away from me and became invisible. Her voice came to me out of the shadows, faintly, "A little while." It died away, remotely. In a breath, the sea of sleep vanished into night. All at once I became aware that I was once more suspended in infinite space, with the green sun now eclipsed by a vast dark sphere. Even in the old Earth days, she had been mine only for a little while. Why had I to wait alone while she slumbered through the years on the still bosom of the sea of sleep? A feeling of grief and fierce resentment filled me. Years melted into the past. Centuries, eons. The green twilight that had reigned for so many millions of years had now given place to an impenetrable gloom. Motionless, I peered about me. Presently I seemed to see circular masses that showed muddily red within the clouded blackness. A while, and they became plainer to my vision. They floated past me continually. In a while, I perceived one of them bearing down upon me. In a minute, it seemed, I was submerged in a deep red mist. This cleared, and I stared confusedly across the immense breadth of the plain of silence. It appeared just as I had first seen it, and I was moving forward steadily across its surface. Presently I saw the distant peaks of the mighty amphitheatre of mountains, where, vast and silent, watched by 1,000 dumb gods, stands the replica of this house of mysteries. This house that I had seen swallowed up in that hellfire ere the earth had kissed the sun and vanished forever. In a still further space of time, I came closer and saw the great rift open before me. I drifted into it, without volition on my part. And then I came out into the enormous arena. There stood the house, huge, monstrous, and silent. So far as I could see, it had not altered in any way. Far to my right, away up in the inaccessible peaks, loomed the bulk of the great ass god. As I floated silently across the arena, I saw the dim forms of many of the other lurking horrors that people those supreme heights. In a little while, I had come so close to the house as to be able to distinguish many of the details about it. The longer I looked, the more I was confirmed in my long-ago impressions of its entire similitude to this strange house. Save in its enormous size, I could find nothing unlike. Suddenly, as I stared, a great feeling of amazement filled me. I had come opposite to that part where the outer door to the study is situated. There, lying across the threshold, lay the great length of coping stone, identical, save in size and colour, with the piece that I had dislodged in my fight with the pit creatures. The sight started off a train of thoughts. I began to understand, with a more than human clearness, that the attack I had repelled was in some extraordinary manner connected with an attack on this strange edifice. I stared at its deep green colour, though now I saw that the colour fluctuated at times, glowing and fading, such as do the fumes of phosphorus when rubbed upon the hand in the dark. But now I was coming up to the great entrance. Here, for the first time, I was afraid, for all in a moment the huge door swung back, and I drifted inside. For a while I was suspended amid the darkness. Below me I seemed to hear a murmurous noise of swine laughter. Then a door opened somewhere ahead, a white haze of light filtered through, and I floated slowly into a room that seemed strangely familiar. All at once there came a bewildering, screaming noise that deafened me. I saw a blurred vista of visions flaming before my sight. My senses were dazed through the space of an eternal moment. Then I saw clearly. I was seated in my chair again, in this old study. My glance wandered around the room, and I saw that nothing had altered in any way. I looked towards the end window. The blind was up. I rose to my feet, shakily, and trod my way to the window. The sun was just rising, lighting up the tangled wilderness of gardens. I stood and stared. Presently, amid the chaos of my senses, a sudden thought came to me. I turned and I called to Pepper. There was no answer, and I stumbled across the room. He was lying in the shadow of the table. Now, as I stooped, I took my breath shortly. There was no Pepper. Instead, I was reaching towards an elongated little heap of grey, ash-like dust. I was stunned. Pepper had really passed into the land of shadows. It is many weeks since I came back from that strange and terrible journey through space and time. If it were not for Pepper, I should be inclined to imagine that it was but a gigantic dream. But somehow I think death is not far away. Not that I fear death, as death is understood. Yet there is that in the air which bids me fear an intangible, cold horror. I felt it last night. I was here in my study, writing. The door leading into the garden was open. At times, the metallic rattle of a dog's chain sounded faintly. It belongs to the dog I have bought since Pepper's death. I will not have him in the house, not after Pepper. Still, I have felt it better to have a dog about the place. They are wonderful creatures. I was much engrossed in my work, and time passed quickly. Suddenly I heard a soft noise on the path outside. Pad, 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 it went. Then the dog gave a long howl. For a moment, perhaps, I peered intently, but could see nothing. I assumed the sound I had heard was the dog walking round his kennel at the length of his chain. A quarter of an hour may have passed. Then all at once the dog began to howl again, and there sounded again that queer pad, pad, pad. I jumped to my feet. The dog growled, and I noted the faint taint of fear in it. Outside on the window-sill, I could see my sister's pet cat. As I looked, it sprang to its feet, its tail swelling visibly. Then it began to back along the sill until it could go no further. There it stood, rigid, as though frozen in an attitude of extraordinary terror. I took a gun from the corner and went towards the door. I had come to within a few paces of it when suddenly a peculiar sense of fear thrilled through me. So great was it that, like the cat, I progressed backwards until the wall brought me up. I stared nervously. Outside in the gardens, the dog moaned. Suddenly, from the cat there came a fierce screech. I glanced in its direction. Something luminous and ghostly encircled it and grew upon my vision. It resolved into a glowing hand, transparent, with a greenish flame flickering over it. The cat gave a last awful caterwaul, and I saw it smoke and blaze. My breath came with a gasp, and I leant against the wall. Over that part of the window there was spread a smudge, green and fantastic. It hid the thing from me. A stench of burning stole into the room. Pad, pad, pad. Something passed down the garden path. The dog had been silent for a few moments. Now I heard him yowl as though in pain. Then he was quiet. A little later, the gate slammed, distantly. I must have stood there some minutes, helpless, staring before me rigidly. Then I made a frightened rush at the door and dashed it to and bolted it. That is all. This morning early, I went through the gardens, but found everything as usual. I examined the path for footprints, yet here again there was nothing to tell me whether I had dreamed last night. It was only when I came to speak to the dog that I discovered some tangible proof that something did happen. He was crouching in his kennel, and I had to coax him out. His manner was cowed and subdued as I patted him, and my attention was attracted to a greenish patch on his left flank. On examination, I found that the fur and skin had apparently been burnt off. The flesh showed raw and scorched. The shape of the mark reminded me of the imprint of a large talon or hand. I thought of the horrible thing I saw last night. The smoky patch was there on my study window. I knew the cause now of that hateful-looking wound on the dog's side. I also knew that what I had seen last night had been a real happening. A great discomfort filled me. Pepper, the cat, and now this poor animal. The dog was licking at his wound. Poor brute. I muttered, and as I left him, I bent to pat his head. He nosed and licked my hand, wistfully. After dinner, I went to see him again. He seemed quiet and disinclined to leave his kennel. From my sister, I learnt that he had refused food all day. She appeared puzzled, though quite unsuspicious of anything of which to be afraid. After tea, I went again to have a look at the dog. He was restless. Before locking up for the night, I moved his kennel away from the wall, so that I could see it from the study window. It is now 2 o'clock, and I am in my study. The door leading into the garden is bolted. So far, the dog has been silent. Through the window, I can make out dimly the outlines of the kennel. Suddenly, I hear a rattle of the dog's chain. As I stare, I see a patch of luminous light shine from the interior of the kennel. It shows distinctly. It is like a hand, and I remember the contour of that fearsome wound on the dog's side. It must be luminous. Why? The minutes pass. My mind is filled with this fresh thing. Then I hear a sound in the garden. It is approaching. Pad, pad, pad. A prickly sensation traverses my spine. The dog whimpers frightenedly. The padding sound is coming closer, down the path. It ceases outside the door. I sit motionless. From the door comes a sound. The latch is being slowly raised. A singing noise is in my ears, and I have a sense of pressure about the head. Then the latch drops with a click into the catch. The noise startles me afresh, yet still I sit. I seem to have lost the power of movement. I am strangely tired, and presently I find myself falling asleep and waking in fits and starts. Then suddenly, although there is no noise, I am wide awake. The very air seems pregnant with terror. I look at the window. As I do so, I gasp and stare. I am looking at a vast, misty swine face, over which fluctuates a flamboyant flame of a greenish hue. It is the thing from the arena. The quivering mouth seems to drip with a continual phosphorescent slaver. Two huge, inhumanly human eyes are looking at me. I am cold with fear. And now a fresh horror has come to me. I am arising from my chair without the least intention. Something is impelling me towards the door. I wish to stop, but cannot. The great swine face has disappeared from the window, and I hear again that stealthy pad, pad, pad. It stops outside the door to which I am being compelled. Again comes the rattle of the latch, and I shiver. I try, I fight, and struggle to hold back. Back! But it is no use. I am at the door, and in a mechanical way I watch my hand go forward to undo the topmost bolt. It does so entirely without my volition. The door is shaken violently, and I get a sickly whiff of mouldy air. The bolt comes out of its socket with a click, and I begin to shake. There are two more bolts. All at once there comes a sudden rattle of iron at my feet. I glance down and realize with unspeakable terror that my foot is pushing back the lower bolt. An awful sense of helplessness assails me. A minute passes, an eternity, then another. My God, help me. I am being forced to work upon the last fastening. I will not! My lips emit a hoarse scream of terror. The bolt is 3 parts drawn now, and still my unconscious hands work towards my doom. Twice I scream out in the supreme agony of my fear. Then, with a mad effort, I tear my hands away. I feel my knees giving. A great blackness is falling upon me. There is a loud thudding upon the door, and I am falling. I have lain there at least a couple of hours. As I recover, I am aware that the candles have burnt out, and the room is in darkness. Cautiously, I get up and feel for the central bolt. I find it and push it back into its socket. Then I secure the other 2. After that, I creep away in the direction of the stairs. Reaching my bedroom, I clamber into bed, all clothed as I am, and pull the clothes over me. After a while, I begin to regain a little confidence. I try to think over the happenings of the past night, but though I cannot sleep, I find it useless to attempt consecutive thought. My brain seems curiously blank. Towards morning, I begin to toss uneasily. I cannot rest, and after a while I get out of bed and pace the floor. Later, I hear Mary bustling about in the old kitchen, getting breakfast ready. I feel little interest. I am not hungry. My thoughts, however, continue to dwell upon her. How little the weird happenings in this house seem to trouble her. Except in the incident of the pit creatures, she has seemed unconscious of anything unusual occurring. She is old, like myself. Yet how little we have to do with one another. After a time, I go to the window. The sun is now above the horizon, and a sense of security, for the time being, comes to me. I go downstairs and out into the garden to have a look at the dog. As I approach the kennel, I am greeted by the same mouldy stench that assailed me at the door last night. Shaking off a momentary sense of fear, I call to the dog, but he takes no heed. Presently my sister joins me and tries to coax him from the kennel with some food. In a little, the poor beast rises and shambles out. In the daylight, he stands, swaying from side to side. I note that the horrid wound is larger, much larger, and seems to have a white fungoid appearance. My sister moves to fondle him, but I detain her and tell her that it is well to be cautious for a few days. Though the food should be tempting, the dog takes no notice of it, but retires to his kennel. I can see that my sister is much puzzled as to what is the matter with the animal. Yet it would be madness even to hint the truth to her. The day slips away uneventfully, and night comes on. I have decided to watch the kennel again, but I have taken precautions. I have driven stout nails in at the back of each of the 3 bolts that secure the study door. This will at least prevent an occurrence of the danger I ran last night. From 10 to about 2 I watch, but nothing occurs, and finally I stumble off to bed, where I am soon asleep. I wake suddenly. It is still dark. My head is aching, and by turns I am hot and cold. I stretch out my hand for the matches to light my candle, and am startled to see a phosphorescent speck of fire shining amid the darkness. It is on my wrist. With the feeling of vague alarm, I strike the match and look, but can see nothing, save a tiny scratch. There is a slight greenish discoloration round it. I am puzzled. Then a thought comes to me. I remember the morning after the thing appeared, the dog had licked my hand. A horrible fear creeps into my brain. The dog's wound shines at night. With a dazed feeling, I sit on the side of the bed and try to think, but my brain is numb with this new fear. Hour after hour I sit and shiver, hopelessly. The day has come and gone, and it is night again. This morning, early, I shot the dog and buried it. My sister is startled and frightened, but it is better so. The foul growth had almost hidden its left side, and the place on my wrist has enlarged, perceptibly. Several times I have caught myself muttering prayers, little things learned as a child. God, Almighty God, help me. 6 days, and I have eaten nothing. It is night. I am sitting in my chair. Ah, God, I wonder have any ever felt the horror of life that I have come to know. I am swathed in terror. This dread growth has covered all my right arm and side and is beginning to creep up my neck. Tomorrow it will eat into my face. I shall become a terrible mass of living corruption. There is no escape. Yet a thought has come to me, born of a sight of the gun rack in the corner. I have looked again, with the strangest of feelings. God, thou knowest, thou must know that death is better, aye, better 1,000 times than this. It will at least spare me that final horror. I think I must have been dozing. I am very weak, and so miserable and tired. The rustle of the paper tries my brain. My hearing seems preternaturally sharp. I will sit a while and think. Hush! I hear something. Down in the cellars. It is a creaking sound. My God, it is the opening of the great trapdoor. What can be doing that? The scratching of my pen deafens me. I must listen. There are steps on the stairs. Strange, padding steps that come up nearer. Jesus, be merciful to me, an old man. There is something fumbling at the door handle. Oh, God, help me now. The door is opening. Slowly. Something... That is all. I put down the manuscript and glanced across at Tonneson. He was sitting, staring out into the dark. Well, I said. Was he mad? No. I opened my lips to offer a contradictory opinion, for my sense of the sameness of things would not allow me to take the story literally. Then I shut them again. Somehow the certainty in Tonneson's voice affected my doubts. I felt all at once less assured. After a few minutes' silence, Tonneson rose and began to undress. What do you say to having another look at... I nodded my head downstream. Never, he said abruptly. I would not go there again for anything you could offer me. Oh! The next morning, we rose late and took our accustomed swim. After breakfast, we spent the day at our favourite sport. We enjoyed the rest of our holiday to the utmost, though both of us looked forward to our driver's arrival, for we were anxious to question him about this strange area. At last the day came on which we had agreed for the driver to come across for us. He arrived early, and we immediately asked the question that was uppermost in our minds. Did he know anything about an old garden and a great pit and a lake, situated some miles away downriver? Also, had he ever heard of a great house thereabouts? No, he did not, and had not. Yet, stay, he had heard a rumour, once upon a time, of a great old house standing out alone in the wilderness. But if he remembered rightly, it was a place given over to the fairies, or, if that had not been so, he was certain that there had been something queer about it. And anyway, he had heard nothing of it for a very long while, not since he was quite a gossoon. "Look here," said Tonnerson, "just take a walk round the village while we get ready, and find out what you can." With a nondescript salute, the man departed on his errand. He was away nearly an hour, and when he returned, it was evident that he had found out something. It appeared that he had got into conversation with an ancient man of the village who knew something of the strange house. The substance of this knowledge was that in the old man's youth there had stood a great house in the centre of the gardens, where now was left only that fragment of a ruin. This house had been empty for a great while, years before the old man's birth. It was a place shunned by the people of the village, as it had been shunned by their fathers before them. No one ever went near it. It was a synonym of all that is unholy and dreadful. And then one day, a man, a stranger, had ridden through the village and turned off in the direction of the house, as it was always termed by the villagers. Some hours afterwards, he had ridden back and then taken the track towards Ardran. Then, for 3 months or so, nothing was heard. At the end of that time, the man reappeared. But now he was accompanied by an elderly woman and a large number of donkeys laden with various articles. They had passed through the village without stopping and gone in the direction of the house. Since that time, no one save the man whom they had chartered to bring over monthly supplies from Ardran had ever seen either of them, and him no one had ever induced to talk. The years had moved onwards, uneventfully enough in that little hamlet, the man making his monthly journeys regularly. One day he appeared as usual on his customary errand. He had passed through the village and gone towards the house. Usually it was evening before he made the return journey. On this occasion, however, he had reappeared a few hours later in an extraordinary state of excitement, and with the astounding information that the house had disappeared bodily, and that a stupendous pit now yawned in the place where it had stood. This news so excited the curiosity of the villagers that they had marched en masse to the place. There they found everything just as described by the carrier. That was all we could learn. Of the author of the manuscript, who he was and whence he came, we shall never know. That same day, we left the lonely village of Creighton. We have never been there since. Sometimes in my dreams, I see that enormous pit, surrounded on all sides by trees and bushes, and the noise of the water rises upwards and blends in my sleep with other and lower noises, while over all